Why am I a slave? He asked so innocently, in bondage and freedom. Why are so why are some people slaves and others masters? He demanded to know, as though representing a child's voice. The subject of my study was with me in the woods and fields, long along the shore of the river, and wherever my boyish wanderings led me, in quotations. Douglas was lucky to enjoy any boyish wanderings as a slave. As autobiographer, he sometimes portrayed himself as just out of the frame of the picture, observing, studying, accumulating the knowledge that might not only free him, but also persuade his audience of the merits of the anti slavery cause. Long before the age of psychology, Douglas provided a portrait of a young slave conducting psychological warfare against slavery, as that system conspired in every way to ensnare, weaken, and ultimately destroy him. Ensnare. Ensnare. His powers of recollection, fashioned beautifully into words, became his only available weapon. In words, Douglas always fought back not only to defeat slavery, but to make sense of its extremes and work through his pain. Why am I a slave? Is an existential question that reflects as well as anticipates many others like it in human history. Why am I poor? Why is he so rich and she only his servant or chattel? Why am I hated for my religion, my race, my sexuality, the accident of my birth in this valley or on that side of the river or on this side of the railroad tracks? Why am I a refugee with no home? Why does my color define my life? Douglas's story represents so many others over the ages. I'm gonna pause there. Once again, that's the Frederick Douglass story. I got so many that I want to indulge in today and get into today. So that's what we're gonna do and continue to move forward here. This conception of justice, jumping back into Justice is Blind. This conception of justice is represented by the figure of a blindfolded woman with a scale in one hand and a sword in the other. All right. It is also what is meant by with liberty and justice for all in the Pledge of Allegiance, that the government will treat its citizens with quotations fairness, equity in quotations, and in a manner that is right. Capular and Potter, 2004. From the title of this book, Justice Blind, you may guess that I am not sure whether our criminal justice network achieves this measure of justice. In fact, I will provide evidence that our criminal justice practices are unjust in many ways. Justice must be blind, or it is not just at all. I will demonstrate in this book that the American criminal justice network is in some ways biased against the poor and people of color, and that in the some situations it discriminates on the basis of gender. The depiction of justice on the cover of this book is also reflected in the American Declaration of Independence. American settlers criticized their quotations British brethren in quotations for being quotations deaf to the voice of justice in quotations. Godfredson, Gottfredson, 1999. This was this was one reason that people came to found this country in the interests of justice apart from the interests of the British monarchy. Of course, history testifies to a different reality. Early Americans wiped out numerous indigenous people and enslaved other groups in the name of manifest destiny, a 19th century doctrine based on the premise that the Americans had the God given right, indeed, the duty to expand their territory and cultural influence throughout North America. Howard are least recognized in accounts of U.S. history. Howard tells his story from the people that are least recognized in accounts of U.S. history: the poor, working people, women, Native Americans, slaves, and other minority groups, and shows that much of what we believe about American history is simply not true. Further, James Loewen, in his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me in 1995, explains how and why Americans are raised to believe their country was founded based on the ideals of freedom for all, when in fact freedoms were structured by social class, ethnicity, and so forth. Still, early Americans envisioned a country where all men could live, thrive, and further their own interests without the burdens imposed by the British monarchy. Conflicting views of justice. Each conception of justice is important when it comes to studying and understanding the criminal justice network. Americans will not support criminal justice practices that fail to punish those who deserve it. Ideally, they will not support them when they wrongfully convict the innocent or are biased against any group. Pound wrote long ago in 1912 that justice requires that serious offenders be convicted and punished, and that the innocent and unfortunate not be wrongly oppressed. Similarly, Harrigan notes that justice is served neither if a guilty person is let go nor if an innocent person is punished. These two conceptions of justice, punishing the guilty but ensuring fairness and impartiality, often conflict. The law places restrictions on the actions of criminal justice actors so that constitutional rights of individuals are not violated. With unlimited powers, law enforcement agencies probably could do a much better job at fighting crime, but numerous liberties that we currently enjoy, such as the right to privacy, would have to be sacrificed. Alright, jumping back into readings for writers. I'm actually really excited about this one. Okay. I had been teaching writing for many years and had published several articles on composition and literature, but I could not call myself a writer. I still cannot, but I can now say confidently that I am writing. I feel presumptuous through I feel presumptuous though describing how I write. The rat in the basement as a colleague, Fred Homer, refers to writing fears, creeps up to remind me that I cannot write not real writing. Of course I write articles for publication and talks for conferences. I have become a whiz at writing abstracts for conference papers before the fact, writing and through two humanities proposals. I have learned to buro- bureaucratize my imagination. That's an interesting word. Bureaucratize. Bureaucratize. bureaucratize my imagination, as Kenneth Burke says. I also write letters, grocery lists, and class notes, and I am presently revising a manuscript on Burke's rhetoric of the symbol. I do not like presently I do not like to write reviews of books I do not like, although I enjoy writing reviews of books I learn from. I began writing poems only last summer during a Wyoming Writing Project Institute in Gillette, Wyoming, and I have never finished a work of fiction, but I will. Having written this, several days later, I finally finished a short story, which certainly needs revision, but which I pushed through to the end. In one sense, then I have learned to write, but my attitude is that I am still learning. Past tense is inappropriate. The biggest rat in my basement remains the definition I still have of writers as people who have published several good novels. I strongly encourage students to name and erase such destructive rats, but my excuse for believing the rat who says I cannot write is that I grew up in the land of Carson McCullers, Flannery O'Connor, Alice Walker, and Eudora Welty. I am like Mary Ann Bachwin, English department chair at Green River High School, who says she never wrote a poem because she felt she was not worthy even to kiss the hem of a poet's garment. We talked about how most poets don't even wear robes anymore. She has begun writing poems. The early drafts, early works, and comments about writing by Welty, Walker, and others have helped me understand writers primarily as people who write and work hard at it. How did I take the plunge? How am I still learning to write? How do I help students begin writing and join the community of writers? How am I learning to overcome the excuses of time, busy work, head tripping, and hems of garments to avoid writing? Most important, I believe I am learning to write not alone, but with others. Take a deep breath, reach out, and write. William Stafford gives me a gentle push in writing The Australian Crawl when he explains how swimmers must have faith that the water will keep them afloat and how writers must have faith that the writing will keep them afloat. The only way to write is to write, not to spend hours, days, and years talking about writing. All right, jumping back into a game called Salisbury. On Saturday, July 14th, the day after the Lillerley murders, Brian and McNeil both on the scene to cover the story. Brian focused his coverage on investigating possible suspects, while McNeil detailed the horrors of the crime scene, which in this case required little embellishment to produce an extraordinarily riveting account. I like that word, riveting. Riveting. Even so, McNeil seemed in no hurry to delve into the gory details. Instead, he lingered a bit in the peaceful setting outside the Lillerley home. Before heading inside to a scene of hellish horror approaching the property, he made note of the groups of men gathered near their buggies and saddle horses in the grove, speaking in low tones. Then he studied the immense elms and sycamores in the front and the style of the house, and concluded correctly that it was an old home place. As he drew nearer to the dwelling, he procrastinated further, taking time to savor the smells of the zinnias and hollyhocks and bloom at the gate and on either side of the walk, and even above all the background noise, he could make out the sound of chickadees and catbirds singing in the elms. But the music ceased even before he reached the door. Just inside the gate, the facade of serenity crumbled with the evidence of the slaughter. On the steps and part of the yard were scattered feathers and burnt pieces of cloth, and in the hall singed feathers and straw were heaped in a corner and thrown about the floor. There was a smell of scorched feathers and flesh, and the rare entry the coroner was holding his inquest, crossing the threshold into the front bedroom. The specific site of the slaughter, McNeil first first focused his eyes on the condition of the room, averting them from the bodies lying mutilated before him. On the middle of the floor was a great pool of blood, not yet congealed. Pillows thrown into a corner were soaked with blood, as were the partly burned quilts and sheets that had been on the beds. At the head of Mr. Lilly's bed, the floor and a heap of shard mattress straw were wet with kerosene oil. The side rail and head of the bedstead were half burnt. Of course, the room was in the utmost disorder. Other reporters were arriving on the scene, and if McNeil hadn't gotten graphic about the grisly details, someone else would have. It was an event on which it was indeed difficult to speak, but impossible to remain silent. Yellow journalism, notwithstanding, the facts are indisputable. A young child was murdered and burned. The body of little John Lilly lay on the floor, parts of it burnt, blackened below his knees. The dry skin was loose and broken. His whole body was purple. Exactly in the top, exactly in the top of his head, the blade of an axe had been driven, perpendicular to his forehead. From the look of the cut, the axe must have sunk halfway to his eyes, and from its position, the boy must have been sitting up. The high head of that bed would have made such a stroke impossible while the child slept. By now, however, the crime scene had been altered. The way things were when McNeil arrived is not how Addie and Mary had found them the night before. When Addie rushed downstairs to determine the source of all the smoke, she found her father and John together in the same bed, according to Bryant, who had gotten his information by questioning the girls the next day. Their story, or at least his version of it, was in the report that accompanied McNeil's in the July 15th issue. He wrote that Addie, upon entering her parents' room, he wrote that Addie, upon entering her parents' room, quotation, saw that the bed on which her father and Johnny slept was burning, and knowing in an instant that something terrible had happened, she rushed to her father and felt his brow and found it was cold. She passed her hand over Johnny's face, and that too was lifeless. By the time McNeil arrived, Isaac's body had been moved to the other bed, the bed that hadn't been burned. And when he looked at Isaac's face, quotations framed with gray hair and gray chin whiskers, he found it, quotations, perfectly calm. They say his eyes were shut when the first of the neighbors saw him. He must have been struck first and killed while he slept. There were two blows, however, one on the front which seem to have been made by the axe handler, handle, or club, and the other behind his left ear. Pause there. Let's get in. I want to keep going and jump into so many I want to jump into, but we can start with Handbook to Higher Consciousness. Handbook to Higher Consciousness. By Ken Keyes Jr. Alright, let's get started here. Alright, we'll read the acknowledgments. The Living Love Way to Happiness and Higher Consciousness is a science of happiness, which was formulated to contribute toward the great awakening now taking place throughout the world. As the system isn't new, but many of the components that make up the Living Love Way have been tried and tested for thousands of years. This vision of the Living Love Way to Happiness was made possible only by standing upon the shoulders of countless individuals who, in different places and times, have had insights into the causes of human happiness and unhappiness. The teachings of Buddha, Patanjali, Christ, and humanistic psychology have been a constant inspiration. Others that have been most helpful are the teachings of Ram Dass and the Buddhist teachings of Shoiguam Trungpa, the teachings of Charles Berner, John Lilly, Alfred Korzybski, Krishnamurti, Pierre Veliat Khan, and Abraham Maslow have played an important part in the author's growth. The noble truths of Buddha have been the fundamental inspiration for the Living Love Way to Happiness. The author is particularly appreciative of the part played in his growth by the Esalen Institute, Ed Elkin, Anata Burner, and David and Terry Hatch, his guru brother and guru sister. Carolyn Terrell contributed her loving editing on the first edition. Cass Moore did the diagram of the human biocomputer. The loving energy of Karen Zieminsky and Lenore Ska has helped in connecting typographical errors. Mark Allen, Tony Birkin, Tony Contea, Dorothy Durham, Rita Gordon, Wesley Hiller, Norma Lewis, Lenore Ska, and Alan Summers offered many valuable suggestions. Susan Stafford designed the Siegel logo, and Marty Johnson did the cover drawing. Since the Living Love Way uses everyday life experiences for growth into higher consciousness, the author wishes to thank the many people who have helped him. First, in a spiritually oriented commune, and later in the Living Love ashram, as well as all the other people in his life, both past and present. Judy and Steve Belts, Martha Lou Castillo, Harper Dance, Mester Hari Das, Ari Goldberg, Jeffrey Nathan, Sita Nelson, Sasha Oliveira, Rudolph Goldberg, Rudolph DiPrizio, Gary Trujillo, And Debbie and Jerry Weisberg have been most helpful and generous with their time in suggesting improvements in the manuscript, since the author, in all cases, made the final decisions. Only he is responsible for any deficiencies. Forward. Millions of years ago, when our animal ancestors had to survive in the jungle, it was necessary to have an instantly effective fight or flight mechanism. When a tiger was about to spring, an automatic emotional response was a lifesaver. A nervous shock was needed to squirt adrenaline into the blood so that muscles became jet powered. Emotional alarms were needed to command full attention when a tiger was ready to jump. There was no time to admire the beautiful sunset. As a jungle survival mechanism, our animal ancestors were programmed for our automatic duality, automatic feelings of otherness, threat, and paranoia. Survival required instant domination of consciousness to meet the perils of the jungle. We are the pioneers in the evolution of human consciousness. It was only about 10,000 years ago that our ancestors built the first cities. As civilization grew, survival no longer depended on the instant fight or flight of the jungle. Survival and happiness now depend on tuning into the overall situation involving ourselves, the people around us, and the total environment of here and now. Perspectiveness, wisdom, and oneness are now the ingredients of effective and happy living. But our biocomputers are still programmed for jungle, fight, or flight. For its fast release of adrenaline into the bloodstream, and for a rapid heartbeat, for automatic anger and fear in our social interactions, our consciousness magnifies molehills and makes them into mountains. And this constant distortion destroys our energy, our insight, and our ability to love. Very interesting. Thus, survival in the jungle meant that we had to be programmed for instant paranoia, instant fear, instant anger, instant perception of duality. Survival in our world today means that we must have instant perceptions of oneness, of love, of compassion with everyone, and understanding of everything around us. When we learn to cut through our paranoid jungle programming, we are on our way to higher consciousness and happiness. Evolution is now working to remedy this primitive jungle alarm wiring in our brain that tends to hold us on lower consciousness levels. Paranoid, dualistic individuals who cannot love themselves and others tend to get heart trouble, ulcers, other psychosomatic diseases, and accident prone, etc. Perhaps in 100,000 years, through the ruthless survival of the fittest, humans may have nervous systems that are automatically structured to produce instant insights that facilitate love and oneness. But that doesn't help you. That doesn't help you and me. We need the living love way to show us how to live in higher consciousness as soon as possible, to override our jungle programming so that we can enjoy living here and now. We have escaped from the domination of instincts, inflexible, unlearned behavior that guides animals through their daily life situations. since the young human is not provided with a full repertoire of automatic fixed responses, we are unable to independently cope with life for a number of years after birth. Interesting. This long period of plasticity and openness to learning complex life guidance patterns help us avoid fixed programming behavior. For example, this long nurturing period lets us learn complex language systems, and our flexibility is such that we can learn to communicate in Swahili as easily as in English or any other language. Instead of a complete pattern of animal type instincts to provide survival responses to life situations, the young child uses ego mechanisms backed by hair trigger emotions to develop security sensation and power magnification of the moment to moment sensory inputs. Our personal development into fulfilling happy lives, as well as the progression of civilization beyond the dangerous power consciousness, depends on our getting free of our ego-backed subject-object method security sensation power hang-ups. We'll pause here for this one. Getting into America and narrative story by David Emery She. Interesting. I did leave off here somewhere. Off there. I'm going to start here. The era of Reconstruction between 1865 and 1877. I'm going to show you all this picture, and then I'm going to read the caption underneath it. This powerful painting by Winslow Homer depicts a plantation mistress visiting her former slaves in the post-war South. Although their living conditions are humble, these freed women stand firmly and eye to eye with the women who had kept them in bondage. In the spring of 1865, the terrible conflict was finally over. The war to restore the Union transformed American life. The United States was a new nation, said an Illinois congressman, because it was now wholly free. At a cost of some 750,000 lives and the destruction of the Southern economy, the Union had won the war, and almost 4 million enslaved Americans had seized their freedom. But the end of slavery did not bring the end of racism, nor did it bring equality to people of color. The defeated Confederates had seen their world turned upside down. The abolition of slavery, the disruptions of the Southern economy, and the horrifying human losses had destroyed the plantation system and upended racial relations in the South. Change indelibly stamped upon everything I meet, even upon the faces of the people. Marveled Alexander Stephens, vice president of the Confederacy. His native region now had to come to terms with a new era and a new order as the U.S. government set about reconstructing the South and policing defiant ex-Confederates. Diarist Mary Chestnut expressed the angry frustration felt by the Southern white elite when she wished that they were all dead, all Yankees. Freed slaves felt just the opposite. Yankees were their saviors. The ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in December 1865 ended all doubt about the status of former slaves by abolishing slavery everywhere. No longer would enslaved workers be sold and separated from their families or prevented from learning to read and write or attending church. I felt like a bird out of a cage, said former slave Houston Holloway of Georgia, who had been sold to 3 different owners during his first 20 years. Amen, amen, amen. I could hardly ask to feel any better than I did that day. Few owners, however, willingly freed their slaves until forced to by the arrival of Union soldiers. A North Carolina planter pledged that he and other whites will never get along with the free Negroes because they were an inferior race. Similarly, a Mississippi planter predicted that the niggers will all be slaves again in 12 months. When a South Carolina white man caught an enslaved mother and her children running toward freedom, he drew his bowie knife and cut her throat. Also the throat of her boy, 9 years old, also the throat of her girl, 7 years of age, threw their bodies into the river and the live baby after them. Such brutal incidents illuminate the extraordinary challenges the nation faced in reconstructing and reuniting a ravaged and resentful South while faced in reconstructing and reuniting a ravaged and resentful South while helping to transform ex-slaves into free workers and equal citizens. It would not be easy. Rebels had been conquered, but they were far from being loyal Unionists. Although the Reconstruction era lasted only 12 years, from 1865 to 1877, it was one of the most challenging and significant periods in the U.S. history. At the center of the debate over how best to restore the Union were questions of continuing significance: who is deserving of citizenship and what does it entail? What rights should all Americans enjoy? What role should be the federal government play in ensuring freedom and equality? Those questions are still shaping American life nearly 150 years later. The war's aftermath in the South. In the spring of 1865, Southerners were emotionally exhausted. A fifth of Southern white males had died in the war. Many others had been maimed for life. In 1866, Mississippi spent 20% of the state's budget on artificial limbs for Confederate veterans. Property values had collapsed. In the year after the war ended, 81 plantations in Mississippi were sold for less than a tenth of what they had been worth in 1860. Confederate money was worthless. Personal savings had vanished. Tens of thousands of horses and mules had been killed in the fighting. and countless farm buildings and agricultural equipment had been destroyed. Many of the largest southern cities, Richmond, Atlanta, Columbia, were devastated. Most railroads and many bridges were damaged or destroyed, and Southerners, white and black, were homeless and hungry. Along the path that General William Tecumseh, Tecumseh Sherman's Union Army had blazed across Georgia and the Carolinas. One observer reported in 1866 the countryside looked for many miles like a broad black streak of ruin and desolation. Burned out Columbia, South Carolina, said another witness, was a wilderness of ruins. Charleston, the birthplace of secession, had become a place of vacant houses, of widowed women, of rotting wars, and deserted warehouses, of weed wild gardens, of miles of grass grown streets, of acres of pitiful and voiceless barons, baroness. Between 1860 and 1870, Northern wealth grew by 50%, while Southern wealth dropped 60%. Emancipation wiped out $4 billion invested in slavery. Emancipation wiped out $4 billion invested in slavery, which had enabled the explosive growth of the cotton culture. Not until 1879 would the cotton crop again equal the record harvest of 1860. Tobacco production did not regain its pre-war level until 1880. The sugar crop of Louisiana did not recover until 1893. And the rice economy along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia never regained its pre-war levels of production or profit. In 1860, just before the Civil War, the South had generated 30% of the nation's wealth. In 1870, it produced but 12%. Amanda Worthington, a planter's wife from Mississippi, assessed the damage. Quotations, "None of us can realize that we are no longer wealthy. Yet thanks to the Yankees, the cause of all unhappiness, such is the case." End quotations. I'm going to pause there too. Pause right there. 1776 by David McCullough. In this stirring book, David McCullough tells the intensely human story of those who marched with General George Washington in the year of Declaration of Independence, when the whole American cause was riding on their success, without which all hope for independence would have been dashed and the noble ideals of the Declaration would have amounted to little more than words on paper. Based on extensive research in both American and British archives, 1776 is a powerful drama written with extraordinary narrative vitality. It is the story of Americans in the ranks, men of every shape, size, and color, farmers, school teachers, shoemakers, no accountants, and mayor boys turned soldiers. And it is the story of the Kingsman, the British commander, William Howe, and his highly disciplined redcoats, who looked on their rebel foes with contempt and fought with a valor too little known. Here also is the revolution as experienced by American loyalists. Haitian mercenaries, politicians, preachers, traders, spies, men and women of all kinds caught in the paths of war. So pretty much, we're just going back 100 years to the Revolutionary War. So the Civil War was in early the early 1860s, which was like 1861 to 1865. So we're going back 100 years to 1776. And at the center of the drama with Washington are two young American patriots who at first knew no more of war than what they had read in books. Nathanael Greene, a Quaker who was made a general at 33, and Henry Knox, a 25-year-old bookseller who had the preposterous idea of hauling the guns of Fort Ticonderoga overland to Boston in the dead of winter. But it is the American commander in chief who stands foremost, Washington, who had never before led an army in battle. The book begins in London on October 26, 1775, when His Majesty King George III went before Parliament to declare America in rebellion and to affirm his resolve to crush it. From the story moves to the siege of Boston and its astonishing outcome, then to New York, where British ships and British troops appear in numbers never imagined, and the newly proclaimed Continental Army confronts the enemy for the first time. David McCullough's vivid rendering of the Battle of Brooklyn and the daring American escape that followed is a part of the book few readers will ever forget. As the crucial weeks pass, defeat follows. Defeat and the long retreat across New Jersey, all hope seems gone until Washington launches the brilliant stroke that will change history. The darkest hours of that trum- tumultuous, tumul- tumultuous year were as dark as any Americans have known, especially in our own tumultuous time. 1776 is powerful testimony to how much is owed to a rare few in that brave founding epoch, and what a miracle it was that things turned out as they did. Written as a companion work to his celebrated biography of John Adams, David McCullough's 1776 is another landmark in the literature of American history. All right, let's move on. Chapter 1, Sovereign Duty. God save great George our King. Long live our noble King. God save the King. Victorious. On the afternoon of Thursday, October 26, 1775, His Royal Majesty George III, King of England, rode in royal splendor from St. James's Palace to the Palace of Westminster, there to address the opening of Parliament on the increasingly distressing issue of war in America. The day was cool, but clear skies and sunshine, a rarity in London, brightened everything, and the royal cavalcade, spruced and polished, shone to perfection. In an age that had given England such rousing patriotic songs as quotations, God Save the King, in quotations, and quotations, rule Britannia, in quotations, in a nation that adored ritual and gorgeous pageantry. It was a scene hardly to be improved upon. An estimated 60,000 people had turned out. They lined the whole route through St. James Park. At Westminster, people were packed solid, many having stood since morning, hoping for a glimpse of the king or some of the notables of Parliament. So great was the crush that latecomers had difficulty seeing much of anything. One of the many Americans then in London, a Massachusetts loyalist named Samuel Curwen, found the mob outside the door to the House of Lords too much to bear, and returned his to his lodgings. It was his second failed attempt to see the king. The time before, His Majesty had been passing by in a sedan chair near St. James, but reading a newspaper, so close to his face that only one hand was showing. The whitest hand my eyes could ever blended with a very large rose diamond ring. Loyalist Curwen recorded. The king's procession departed St. James at a 2 o'clock proceeding at walking speed. By tradition, 2 horse grenadiers with swords drawn rode in the lead to clear the way, followed by gleaming coaches, followed with nobility, then a clattering of horse guards. The yeomen of the guard in red and gold livery, and a rank of footmen, also in red and gold. Finally came the king in his colossal golden chariot, pulled by 8 magnificent cream-colored horses. Hanoverian creams, a single postilion riding the left lead horse, and 6 footmen at the side. No mortal on earth rode in such style as their king, and English as their king the English knew. 24 feet in length and 13 feet high, the royal coach weighed nearly 4 tons, enough to make the ground tremble when under way. George III had it built years before, insisting that it be superb. 3 glided cherubs on top, symbols of England, Scotland, and Ireland, held high a gilded crown, while over a heavy spoked wheels, front and back, loomed 4 gilded sea gods, formidable reminders that the Britannia ruled the waves. Allegorical scenes on the door panels celebrated the nation's heritage, and windows were of sufficient size to provide a full view of the crowned sovereign within. It was as though the very grandeur, health, and weight of the British Empire were rolling past, an empire that by now included Canada, that reached from the seaboard of Massachusetts and Virginia to the Mississippi and beyond, from the Caribbean to the shores of Bengal. London, its population at nearly 1 million souls, was the largest city in Europe and widely considered the capital of the world. Now, mind you, this is mid to late 1700s. George III had been 22 when in 1760 he succeeded to the throne, and to a remarkable degree he remained a man of simple tastes and few pretensions. He liked plain food and drink but little, and wine only. Defying fashion, he refused to wear a wig. That the palace at St. James had become a bit dowdy bothered him not at all. He rather liked it that way. Socially awkward at court occasions, many found him disappointingly dull. He preferred puttering about his farms at Windsor, dressed in farmer's clothes, and in notable contrast to much of fashionable society and the court, where mistresses and infidelities were not only an accepted part of life, but often flaunted. The king remained steadfastly faithful to his very plain queen, the German princess Charlotte Sophia of Mecklenburg Strelitz, with whom by now he had produced 10 children. Ultimately, there would be 15. Gossips claimed Farmer George's chief pleasures were a leg of mutton and his plain little wife. But this was hardly fair, nor was the unattractive, dim-witted man critics claimed then and afterward, tall and rather handsome, with the clear blue eyes and a generally cheerful expression. George III had a genuine love of music and played both the violin and piano. His favorite composer was Handel, but he adored also the music of Bach, and in 1764 had taken tremendous delight in hearing the boy Mozart perform and perform on the organ. He loved architecture and did quite beautifully architectural drawings of his own. With a good eye for art, he had begun early to assemble his own collection, which by now included works by the contemporary Italian painter Canaletto, as well as watercolors and drawings by such old masters as Poussin and Raphael. He avidly collected books to the point where he had assembled one of the finest libraries in the world. He adored clocks, ship models, took great interest in things practical, took great interest in astronomy, and founded the Royal Academy of Arts. He also had a gift for putting people at their ease. Samuel Johnson, the era's reigning arbiter of all things of the mind, and no easy judge of men, responded warmly to the unaffected good nature of George III. They had met and conversed for the first time when Johnson visited the King's Library, after which Johnson remarked to the librarian, "Sir, there may be talk of the King as they will, but he is the finest gentleman I have ever seen." Stories that he had been slow to learn, that by age 11 he still could not read, were unfounded. The strange behavior, the so called madness of King George III, for which he would be long remembered, did not come until much later, more than 20 years later, and rather than mental illness, it appears to have been porphyria, a hereditary disease not diagnosed until the 20th century. Look that up. Porphyria, mental illness. Interesting. All right. I'm going to pause there. There.